So thank you all for joining us today. And I would like to thank Mike Murphy for also being here with us. He is a local editor from the Daily Messenger, and he will be discussing the Great American Baseball Card Flipping, Trading, and Bubblegum book by Brenda C. Boyd. And he is very adventurous today, and he will be doing another review also of the Wax Pack by Brad. I can't pronounce the last name, but I believe it's Balukjian. So I will turn it over to Mike to get started. And just a quick note that at the end of the presentation, it will be open up for questions, and you can direct those into the chat, or I will open it up for verbal questions, and you will be able to raise your hand, and I will allow everyone the opportunity to do verbal questions as well. And I will turn it over to Mike to get started.
Oh, thank you, Alexis. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the Book Sandwiched In program. It's a great way to celebrate the importance of reading in everyday life. And I hope I don't set back the cause with my presentation today. But it seems like an appropriate day to talk about baseball on a cold, gray, snowing where I am now, February day. And hopefully it'll just be something to do before we have to get out and shovel. So we'll go from there. So yes, I'll start off the presentation. I'm going to do, I'm a writer, so I wrote out my presentation, and I'm a reader, so I will read it. I'll try to do it as painlessly as possible for you. So to begin, baseball is a game of statistics. How many runs, how many hits, how many errors? Ultimately, who won and how did it happen? But at its core, baseball also is a game of memories. Because the great home run king Henry Aaron died recently, along with several other great baseball players, Hall of Famers from my youth, my thoughts drifted back to April 1974 when Aaron's Atlanta Braves faced the Los Angeles Dodgers. Aaron squared off against lefty Al Downing, who served up a fastball that Aaron drove over the left field fence, and by doing so, drove Aaron into baseball lore, surpassing Babe Ruth at the top of baseball's most iconic record. I remember watching the game on TV. No, I wasn't there. I was too young. Not that we would have gone anyway, but and I listened to Hall of Fame announcer Curt Gowdy with the call on TV. I remember lying on the floor in my family room, anxious and happy. So 715 was his statistic. Aaron, who had endured racist taunts on the field and hateful letters off of it, including death threats, jogged slowly around the bases as he did 714 times before. I remember two fans running onto the field and congratulating Aaron as he neared third base. Baseball melds statistics and memories in a great way that I think is unique to all sports. Anyway, those were the days, and in the 1970s, many Americans also sang along with the All in the Family theme song. Those were the days. I'll say you my Edith Bunker imitation. Maybe it was the energy crisis that had Americans on edge in the 1970s. I'm sure the Watergate scandal that led to the downfall of President Richard Nixon also had everyone reminiscing about the good old days, happier days. So maybe it was the TV show Happy Days, which reintroduced Bill Haley and the Comets and their Rock Around the Clock in the 1950s to a beleaguered nation. And this also helped introduce the 1950s era to people like me. Hey, as Arthur Fonzarelli, the Fonz, would say to Richie Cunningham, Potsy, and Ralph Malph. I also enjoyed a different kind of history lesson through baseball. A 10-year-old, or maybe I was 11, or maybe I was older. Who remembers these days exactly? I somehow obtained a colorful paperback copy of the Great American Baseball Card Flipping, Trading, and Bubblegum book by Brenda C. Boyd and Fred Harris. I think they needed two authors to write the book's title. Here's what it looks like. Defying all reading conventions, this is a book that you certainly can judge by its cover. I know I did. This little baseball geek. Around this time, I could tell you each team's starting lineup. Today, I mix up my kids and my wife's birthdays when I pick up prescriptions. I judge this book by the cover. Lots of yellow, blue, and red, and scores of pictures of baseball cards, including that of Herb Score, the picture with the Cleveland Indians. That's him right here. Ralph Branca of the then Brooklyn Dodgers in the back, right there. Inside, pictures of more players and the author's descriptions and remembrances of the cards they collected when they were young. These all ball players of the 1950s and 60s. Before my time, indeed, but of a time. I'd heard of the names before, or some of the names before anyway. Ted Williams. I was and still am a Boston Red Sox fan. Teddy Ballgame, they called him, and as the authors noted, quote, in 1955, there were 77,263,127 male American human beings. And every one of them in the heart of hearts would have given 2 arms, a leg, and his collection of Davy Crockett iron-ons to be Teddy Ballgame. As I would soon learn, the book wasn't to be about just the big stars, although some others joined Williams in earning mention, like the great Dodger southpaw Sandy Koufax and the Pittsburgh Pirates great Roberto Clemente, although on his card he was called Bob. As everyone who had ever gambled a nickel, dime, or a quarter, and I have no idea how much a pack goes for these days, you were more likely to get a card that resembled your friend's dad down the street. Reno Bertoia, Wayne Terwilliger, Foster Castleman. Quote, right out of the old shoebox, as the back cover reads, quote, remember all those gum-dusty baseball cards you collected, flipped, swapped, and memorized the backs of? Here they are, wrapped up in one super package by 2 guys who lived way back when with you. So your mother threw out your cards? See him again. I got to thinking about this book last year. I think a lot of people had time to think about the good old days when the COVID-19 quarantine first hit. Some give nostalgia a bad name. I think that helped us all hang on, at least until the summer and businesses and restaurants started opening up again. The authors wrote, quote, someday there will be nostalgia for the 70s, as hard as that may be to realize now. I should have mentioned earlier, the book was written in 1974. So this prompted a question in my mind. How will we look back on 2020, some 20 years from now? With nostalgia? I'm sure there'll be painful memories for memories, but in there, I think there will be some fond memories as well. Anyway, last year at this time, I was supposed to give a talk on the Berrytown Trilogy, a 3-part chronicle of an Irish family, the first of which the film The Commitments was based on. The presentation was supposed to be the day before St. Patrick's Day. If you remember, that was the day before New York shut down because of COVID. My talk was postponed. Where was this 11th hour reprieve that I had wished for back in high school and college the last times I publicly presented a book report? Shortly afterwards, I picked up the book, The Wax Pack. Okay, I had it delivered. This book by Brad and, of course, Alexis reminded me during the introduction that I forgot to look up how to pronounce his name too. Covered his attempts to track down all the players in a single baseball card pack from 1986, his first year collecting cards. And one thing I noticed this morning, how similar the covers of these 2 books are. Lots of colors, baseball cards. No wonder I picked it up or had it delivered. Anyway, the author was able to track down the likes of Jamie Kochenauer, Randy Reddy, and Don Carmens, not stars at all, and Gary Templeton and Lee Mazzilli, much more talented and well-known, on the, quote, open road in search of baseball's afterlife. Of course, when that book came through and I read of the author's attempts to actually physically track down these old ball players to see what they were doing, good, bad, indifferent, and the efforts it took him to manage this, it got me thinking about this book again. In this book's afterwards, quote, some final observations on trading, hoarding, collecting, and other aberrations of the baseball card life. The authors lament sharing things everyone remembers about baseball cards. This book seemed more fun than the other. The other seemed like almost like a quest for the Holy Grail. The quest for the Holy Grail in this, getting good baseball cards and other things, as the authors share things everyone remembers about them. One is the chalky powder known as bubblegum dust. I'm sure everyone remembers this who's ever had a baseball card pack. There are others, but the authors forgot them, except for this one, which some will swear is as true an adage as the sun will come up tomorrow, and whatever can go wrong will. As a Murphy, I feel like I wrote Murphy's Law and live it, so I feel like I can quote it. Quote, your mother threw them out one sunny summer morning. There was no possible way to get them back. Fortunately, my mother didn't touch those cards in my 1970s youth. I think this book helped that as I drilled it into her head growing up. Don't ever throw these cards out. They might be worth money someday. My mother didn't. And looking back on my cards, they're probably not worth money these days. Too bad. But they're worth a lot in memories. And included among the boxes of baseball cards, which were bundled together with rubber bands and sorted by teams and years, was this book, fading and barely holding it together. You can see, might not make it through the presentation. So in going through the book, the first thing that comes up is the acknowledgments. So be truthful. Who reads a book's acknowledgments? Ordinarily, that's as scintillating a read as reading the ingredients on a stovetop stuffing box. On these 5 pages, however, the tone is set for the rest of the book. One of the authors writes of how he reads a book entirely, stem to stern, and asks if he's alone in this custom of reading who authors are grateful for. Quote, to Rocco and Nip, compulsive disentanglers of life's irrepressible imbroglio. I wish I had read that before I wrote that. To Moish, who laughed. I mean, who the hell reads this stuff anyway, the author wonders, or understands it, or even cares? Just me and you? And right away, this book becomes less a recitation of statistics and more a comic look at the people whose cards make up this book and an era. But before we get into the cards, why do kids collect baseball cards? Or these days, I guess, Pokemon cards. The authors actually set their kid collecting schedule to paper. In September, football cards, then jackknives, yo-yos, water pistols, caps, puzzles, and Pez candy. Come March, baseball cards, a sure sign that the end of the agony of winter is almost over. They bought their cards at dime stores and corner stores that also sold, among other things, quote, cornflakes, teething rings, egg cups, snow tires, garter belts, insecticide, gefilte fish, Scrabble sets. And the candy, malted milk balls, Mary Janes, red hot dollars, fireballs. Excuse me. This also is about the time when major leaguers begin spring training games in Florida and Arizona. And, quote, the world was beginning to thaw out around us up north. This will be our year, we all thought of our teams. And with such optimism, the arrival of packs of baseball cards. Their allure was inescapable. Excuse me. Quote, the joy of breaking open the year's first package, and the sweet, pleasant smell of the bubble gum, and the sweet, pleasant melting of it in your mouth, and the secure feeling of the cards in your pocket, and the knowledge that they were yours and yours alone. Until, that is, quote, the possibilities of wheeling and dealing and pyramiding, trading cards with your friends, or more accurately, trying to rip off your friends by offering a Sam Esposito card for a Henry Aaron card. If you really want to learn the art of the deal, don't go to Donald Trump. Talk to a 10-year-old with his eyes on a coveted Carl Yastrzemski card. How did baseball cards even come into play? The authors actually provide a bit of a look back on this. And in rereading the book, I found a section of the business side of baseball cards fascinating. And a guy named Seymour Cy Berger, especially so. No, he's not one of the ball players. At the time of the book's writing, he was head of the Topps Chewing Gum Sports Department. Topps, as some may know, is to baseball cards as we know them, as Amazon is to packages on your doorstep. The company at the time was based in what's called the bubblegum capital of the world, Brooklyn. That's where the authors paid a visit with Cy. Sorry about that. Little dry throat. At the time in the 1970s, Cy was responsible for 250 million cards in the US, worth a cool $8 million in retail, all sold with 25 million slabs of bubblegum. When he got his start in the 1950s, Cy told the authors the company had nothing. Nothing, that is, but an idea and a list of ball players' names. Cy would write all the copy on the backs of the cards, hometown, stats, noteworthy anecdotes, and he did this in his living room. Quote, Jesus, it was murder, he told the authors. You know the agony of trying to think up something nice to say about some guy who hit 176 last year and made 25 errors? What can you say? This guy stinks. But they couldn't say that. But clearly it would get better for Cy and his coworkers. Again, at the time of the author's interview, the company sold over 1.5 billion pieces of bazooka bubblegum and manufactured over 500 million cards. Sports and other collector cards, that is. The company had revenues of $33.8 million, gross profit on sales of $12.9 million, and net income before taxes of $2.5 million. Topps president Joel Shorn earned $114,363 a year. Remember, this was the early 1970s, not today. And this didn't include stock options and profit sharing. Shorin's grandfather, Morris Shorin, founded the American Leaf Tobacco Company in 1890, which by the time of the Great Depression began looking for a new way to hang on. Excuse me. They did so by becoming a chewing gum company. Its first gum was produced in 1938 and sold for a penny. At the end of World War II, the company produced its first bazooka gum. Perhaps you've chewed a piece and enjoyed the bazooka gum comic it was wrapped in. Or groaned, anyway, at the puns. Well, baseball cards have been around for some time, so had the companies that produced them. Topps reinvented the game in 1951 with the hard work of people like Cy, and by the time of this book's writing, the company was the only game in town. Players also got a cut. Topps paid players on the big league roster $250, excuse me, and $250 annually each year he stayed in the majors, plus royalties. I can only imagine what it is today. That's my way of saying I didn't research it. As the authors noted, quote, all those nickels seem to mount up pretty fast. Bubblegum isn't just peanuts after all. Cy explained how it all works. After deciding who will be on the cards and the format on which they will be immortalized on cardboard, they get to work. Most of the photos of players were taken during spring training or at various points during the season. Most, looking back, are profile pictures and portraits. Some are actually artwork. Over time, action photos took hold. Then the staff begins writing interesting anecdotes, little sidelights about each of the players. Quote, but the kids are in love with statistics, so of course we have to give them what they want, Cy said. After checking and rechecking, the cards are sent to the art department where commercial artists and graphic designers take a cut. In addition to gum products, Topps also did cards on all sorts of subjects. Davy Crockett, Hopalong Cassidy, Elvis, the Beatles, Batman and the Partridge Family. But baseball was Cy's game. A fan at heart, he talks of the players he's befriended in doing this work. He also talks of the exacting details that go into making each card right. Cy mentions the 787 cards printed the previous year and the amount of labor that went into each of them. Quote, a kid picks up a package of cards in some variety store. He has no idea the kind of detail work involved. At my first reading of this book, I had no idea, nor did I care. Like the 77,263,127 male American human beings who wanted to be Ted Williams, I wanted to be Henry Aaron or Willie Mays or Carl Yastrzemski. I would have settled on being Louis Tiant or Rico Petrocelli, players whose cards I had and liked how their names sounded. Anything in order to walk onto the diamond at Fenway Park, my late father's well-worn and oiled up Bobby Shant signed glove on my left hand, and ready to play ball. I had a lot in common with the people depicted on the cards in the main section of the book, which appropriately enough is called Profiles. They desired to play in the major leagues, and like every kid my age at the time, I wanted to play major leagues. Unfortunately, all I lacked was the talent and a card, which brings us to the fun part of the book. Of course, I had planned to kind of show some of these cards, but now that my book is falling apart, I'll have to do the best I can with it. But anyway, this is, I first read this book nearly 50 years ago. How time flies. But rereading it again, it proved to me that I am interested in the players, where they came, and all about them. The authors probably could have made a mint if they had concentrated on the star players of their use. But as anyone who's purchased packs of baseball cards before, you're more apt to get the players Cy spoke of earlier. They stunk. And the authors, in many cases, let readers know it. The authors comment on everything from their prowess on the diamond, or more accurately, their lack of, to their appearances, to whatever popped in their heads. In other words, kind of a precursor to Twitter and Facebook today. And like social media today, the authors could be brutal. Just ask hard-partying, woman-chasing Bo Belinsky, a Philadelphia Phillies pitcher at the time of his card, the subject of a cautionary tale of talent wasted. Quote, what he could have done in baseball had he been serious about the whole thing is an entertaining speculation. But since Bo didn't really seem to have cared, why should we? Or Boston Red Sox shortstop Eddie Brosseau. Quote, there are certain ball players who are so colorless in their habits, so commonplace in their demeanor, so totally lacking in the essential dramatic fire of athletic combat, that the best that anyone, even their most ardent admirers, can think to say about them is that they are steady. That's certainly an above average description of what it's like to be average. And more on the colorless, utterly average Brosseau. Quote, an itinerant shortstop of modest pretensions and equally modest accomplishments, whose performances were so lacking in variation and whose character was so unflappable in crisis that he was finally gifted by his hordes of enthusiastic admirers with a nickname commensurate with his stress rate. Yes, I'm afraid you're right. Steady Eddie. On poor Eddie Mixis, who played with the Cleveland Indians and was the sort of guy that if you were introduced to at a party and he told you he was a big league ball player, you'd think he was kidding. In a way, he would have been, the authors noted. Player's looks was not off limits either. Rocky Bridges, an infielder with the Detroit Tigers, looked more like a ball player than probably any ball player who ever lived. Quote, his head looked like a sack of rusty nails. His uniform looked as if he had slept in it, which of course he probably had. Ouch. The authors did no whitewashing of the problems and issues of the times. They also delved into serious matters such as race and how bigotry, discrimination, and segregation ruined the careers of Black players. On Satchel Paige, a great pitcher in the old Negro leagues before finally being allowed to play in the major leagues at the age of 42. Quote, Satchel Paige could have been the greatest pitcher in Major League history if he had been given the chance. Left unsaid is that this sentiment could have been applied to most every Black who didn't get that chance. Paraphrasing one of the sage-like Page's most famous quotes, the authors write, quote, don't look back, America. Something might be gaining on you. Along this theme, Larry Doby, on being the first Black player in the American League, which really means he was the second Black player in the major leagues to Jackie Robinson, the authors write that, quote, is a little like being the second person to invent the telephone. Doby, the authors noted, was not quite as talented a ball player or as colorful as Robinson, but he was good. Quote, he was the right man, all right, but certainly not in the right time or place. Even Rochester gets a mention, although not exactly a favorable one. In describing Cincinnati Reds first baseman Steve Bilko, quote, if Rochester was New York City, Steve Bilko would be in the Hall of Fame. As we all know, it isn't, and he isn't. As kids, we often thought that baseball was life or death until confronted with actual life and death. The authors write of their first encounter with the underlying frailty of the human condition. Boston Red Sox first baseman Harry Aganis, the handsome Golden Greek as he was known, All-American quarterback at Boston University, good student, clean cut, teen idol, youth leader, and in 1955, at the age of 25, dead of leukemia. Quote, up until then, death had been something that only happened to animals or in the movies or to bank robbers or people who had fires in their houses or to the old. But Harry Aganis? If something like this could happen to Harry Aganis, then what was to become of us? What indeed? But on a lighter note, a much lighter note, this part I reread and I found it hysterical back in the day. I found it hysterical today. It concerns nicknames. This is always something I have always wanted to write a column about people's nicknames or stories about people's nicknames and how they got them. And this may not be true, but I don't hear much about people even having nicknames anymore. Growing up, I had a few. I'm a Murphy, so Murph, Murph the Surf, Murph the Turf, Smurf, Smurfy, Big Mike, although they had more to do with why they call bald people Curly. And don't call me Curly. I've always wanted to write a column or stories about people with great nicknames, as I said before, and I was definitely inspired by a 6-page section of this book. What would baseball be without nicknames, the writers ask. My all-time favorite, Boston Red Sox first baseman Dick Stewart, who was so epically inept in the field that he earned not one, not two, but 3 nicknames that captured his inability to catch the baseball. Dr. Strangeglove was one. The Boston Strangler and Stonefingers were the others. Quote, Stu once picked up a hot dog wrapper that was blowing toward his first base position. He received a standing ovation from the crowd. It was the first thing he had managed to pick up all day, and the fans realized that it could very well be the last. In no particular order, a few more that still prompt a knowing chuckle, and a, huh? Here we go. Bow Wow Arft. This one gets me a lot. Hillbilly Bill Dilly. Twinkle's Host. Bunyan Zider. Cuddles Marshall. Peekaboo Veach. Mysterious Walker. Symphony Chiffon. Dingaling Clay. Tomato Face Lamabe. Bananas Bennis. Bootnose Hoffman. Peaceful Valley Deezer. Goober Zuber. I almost lost it there. Twinkle Toes Selkirk. Cotton Pippin. Mother Watson. Maybe after reading through that list, society perhaps calls for more adult names as we grow older. As the authors ask, can calling a grown man Ducky or Footsie possibly be justified? So, in conclusion, the book ends with a card of Boston Braves utility infielder Sibby Sisti, a Buffalo native. The author's last words, quote, "Good night, Sibby Sisti, wherever you are." At the time, I took it as a funny way to end the book. I reached out to a friend of mine from back in the day, Todd Walsh, who in addition to serving as a pre- and post-game show host for the baseball Arizona Cardinals and hockey's Arizona Coyotes, is the only other person in the world I know who read this book. And he did it at roughly the same time, and we think we did it without each other knowing it. He said, "I don't remember how that happened, but then we seemed to relish that we both had it." And we did. We'd go through the hallways, kind of quoting things here and there, trying to make each other laugh. Maybe in classes too, but for the most part, we paid attention, right? The book's ending at the time of this first reading meant dreaming of a life in and around baseball. Now, Todd said, quote, "Sibby circa 2021 means I am somehow trying to end the journey, wondering how I found it and Sibby in the first place. But baseball in the end is simply an endless game of repeated summers." Interestingly enough, the authors produced no write-up of Sisti, or Sebastian Daniel, as his mother may have called him. They left it up to me, but he was 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighed 175 pounds. He played 13 years in the majors, interrupted by 3 years of military service during World War II. And while he didn't exactly set the baseball world on fire, he did enough to last 13 years. And he helped perpetuate the idea that baseball can be a game for everyone. Today, I think baseball has lost its path somewhat. I mean, if you're not 6 feet 4 inches tall and can slug a ball 500 feet or throw a ball 100 miles an hour, maybe writing is the way to go, not baseball. Not to sound like the get off my lawn guy, but the game should not just be all about superstars, but ordinary people like Sibby Sisti, who accomplished what for many kids was an extraordinary feat, just not in an overly extraordinary way. If he could play in the big leagues, anybody could. Maybe I could, I thought. His top salary, incidentally, was $12,000. He is a Hall of Famer. According to a bio in the Great Buffalo Sports Hall of Fame, quote, "His hustle and perseverance in the face of numerous injuries made him a fan favorite." He would go on to coach and manage for years after his playing days ended. He was a baseball lifer, as they call them in the game, and a natural, literally. He also scored a small role in the movie The Natural, starring Robert Redford. With a hindsight of nearly 50 years, perhaps the authors could see the future of the game today. Salaries in the tens of millions, bulked up players resembling no one I know of today. And in a way, perhaps seeing how baseball, once America's pastime, may have passed by new generations. Where are you, Sibby Sisti, and the other players just like you? We need you. That concludes this portion of the Book Sandwiched In show. I'm not sure if we have questions or...
So if you have any questions,
somebody with a hook wants to pull me off the stage, or
feel free to use the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can open it up for you to ask them verbally. So Dan says, could you please hold up the second book?
Here's the second book. This one is a little more, where I noted before that this one was kind of a lighthearted look. This one's more of a serious look at, you know, where, I didn't go into the presentation too much about it, but how these people who ended up being idolized, excuse me, not organized, that's not even a word. And you think I'd make a living at it too. How they're idolized, how they kind of fall back into normal society. Some handle it better than others. Some not at all. Some still in the game, some are not. So an interesting contrast between the two.
I have a wonderful job. Loved hearing about your childhood. Which card is your most valued possession?
Well, funny, somebody should ask that. I'll see if I can do this here. It may not be valuable per se, but it is a Hank Aaron card from, I think this is 71 or 72. Unfortunately, it's beat up, so it's probably not worth anything. But like I said, I was growing up, he was chasing the biggest record of all time right when I was in that impressionable age. So that's one of them. And I got a few others of him and stuff. But as I may have mentioned, a couple years ago when cleaning out my mother's house, went through the cards all through this entire time. I'm thinking, I got a mint. I got all this, but I'm afraid to look. But in cleaning them out, I figured, all right, let me look through. And like the authors noted, most everybody I have is these players who amounted to nothing. Cards probably were worth more in 1971, 72 than they are today. So, oh well, I guess I'll keep working for a living.
And Dan says, wow, to the Hank Aaron card.
Thanks, Dan.
And do we have any other questions for Mike?
Oh, that works for me.
It doesn't look like it. We have a comment that says home run.
Oh, thank you. I didn't hit too many of them in my youth, so I'll take one now.
And Dan also said nice story earlier.
Thanks, Dan. Yes. Now I know what it's like for Dan now to be on the other side of this. So,
so if there are no other questions in the chat, and if no one wants to talk verbally, I just want to thank everyone for attending today. And thank you again, Mike, for your wonderful book review. And I didn't know so much about baseball cards until today, and like all the work people put into actually like making them and everything that went into it until today. If you wanted to check out any of those books, they were available at the downstairs or at the entrance in Wood Library for checkout in front of the circulation desk. So they might still be there. So if you were interested, you might still be able to find Wax Pack downstairs or the Bubblegum Trading Card book. If not, they should be returning within the next couple of weeks so that they can be back in circulation again. Again, thank you again, Mike. And check out any of the other book sandwich dens on Mondays at noon. And thank you again, everyone.